Ever feel like you're just spinning your wheels trying to learn a new language? Like you're putting in the time but not really getting anywhere.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well.
Right. So I was really curious to check out this book by Alessandro Bonatti. It's called Second Language Teacher Education.
Okay.
And it's got a really long subtitle, but basically it's all about a more cognitive and evidence-based way to think about teaching languages.
Interesting.
And, one of the things that really struck me right off the bat, and I think you'll appreciate this, is how much emphasis he puts on this idea of input.
Okay, yeah. Input's huge.
So for anyone who's not familiar with the lingo, input basically just means all the language we're exposed to, right? So like if I'm trying to learn Spanish, listening to music in Spanish, watching movies, that all counts as input.
Yeah, definitely. Even just overhearing a conversation in a cafe, that's input too.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Bonatti makes a really important distinction between input and what he calls intake.
Oh, okay. So like what's the difference there?
Yeah, so think of it this way. Imagine you're at a buffet, right? There's all this amazing food laid out in front of you.
Okay.
That's your input. That's all the language that's out there. But the intake, that's the food you actually put on your plate, you eat, you digest, and it becomes part of you.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so it's not just enough to be passively surrounded by the language. It's got to be stuff that our brains can actually process and absorb.
Right, because you can have all the food in the world at that buffet, but if you don't actually eat it, it's not going to do you any good.
Exactly. And Bonatti argues that one of the biggest keys to turning input into intake is this idea of comprehensible input.
Okay, so like what does that mean? Comprehensible input.
So it basically means that the language we're exposed to needs to be understandable. It can't be so far above our level that it just sounds like noise.
Right.
So, for example, if I'm a beginner in Italian and I try to watch a really complex film like La Dolce Vita without subtitles, it's probably not going to be very helpful.
Right, it's going to go right over your head.
Exactly. But if I start with something simpler, like maybe a children's cartoon or a podcast designed for learners, then my brain actually has a chance to latch on to those words and phrases.
Right, makes sense. So it's like building a house. You wouldn't start with a roof, you'd start with a solid foundation.
Exactly. And in language learning, that foundation is built on comprehensible input. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately because I know I've definitely had those moments where I'm trying to learn a language and I'm just like bombarding myself with all this complex stuff like grammar rules.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, I just feel so overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in that, especially when you're first starting out.
Right. And so what Bonatti's saying is it's actually more effective to kind of shift that focus. So instead of getting bogged down in all the little details, it's more about just trying to get the gist, the overall meaning of what you're hearing or reading.
Okay, so it's more about understanding the message than being able to dissect every single word.
Exactly. And speaking of grammar, Bonatti actually has some really interesting things to say about that, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, he kind of challenges this traditional idea that grammar instruction is like the be-all and end-all of language learning.
Really?
Yeah, like he's not saying grammar's not important,
Right.
but he's saying that this explicit grammar instruction, like memorizing all the rules and doing endless verb conjugations,
Yeah.
that might not be the most effective way to actually become fluent.
Okay, interesting. So if it's not all about the grammar drills, then what is it about?
Well, he talks about this idea of implicit learning, which is basically where your brain is kind of unconsciously absorbing those patterns and structures of the language just through consistent exposure to meaningful input.
Okay, so like more of a natural, intuitive way of learning.
Exactly.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, think about how you learned your first language as a kid. You didn't sit there with flashcards memorizing grammar rules before you started speaking. Right?
Yeah, definitely not.
Right. You just picked it up naturally by hearing it spoken around you all the time.
That's so true. Okay, so we've talked about input, intake, a little bit about grammar, but what about actually speaking the language? Where does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yep.
Like, how important is output?
So how does Bonatti say speaking fits into all this? Like, it feels important, but is it really?
It's a really good question. It's something I think a lot of language learners struggle with.
Right, because we want to speak. We want to have those conversations.
Yeah.
But then it can feel so intimidating,
Absolutely. And Bernardi's view on output is actually kind of nuanced.
Okay, how so?
So he's not saying that output isn't important. In fact, he actually points out that it can be really valuable, but maybe not in the way that we traditionally think.
Oh, okay, this is interesting.
So, traditionally we might think, okay, I need to practice speaking as much as possible because that's how I'll get better.
Right. The more you speak, the more fluent you'll become.
Right, exactly. But Bonatti suggests that output, especially when we're interacting with others, can actually be most helpful in kind of revealing to us the gaps in our knowledge.
Oh,
So it's
interesting.
like, you're trying to have a conversation and you realize, wait, I actually don't know how to say this particular thing.
Like when you're trying to explain something and the words just won't come out.
Exactly. And those moments, as frustrating as they can be in the moment,
Oh, tell me about it.
those are actually really valuable learning opportunities
Okay.
because they're showing you, hey, this is what I need to work on.
So instead of being afraid of messing up, I should be looking for those moments as a way to kind of pinpoint where I need to improve.
Exactly. And Bonatti even calls those communication breakdowns golden opportunities for learning.
So all those times I've stumbled through a conversation feeling like a total language learning failure, those were actually helping me.
In a way, yeah, because they were highlighting the areas where you need to focus your attention. And Bonatti actually gives some really cool examples of this in the book.
Oh, I bet. Can you share one?
Yeah, so he talks about how, in trying to express themselves, learners might realize, oh, wait, I actually don't know how to use this particular grammatical structure correctly. Or I need to expand my vocabulary in this specific area. And it's that kind of noticing that really helps drive progress.
So it's like you don't know what you don't know until you try to actually use it in a real conversation.
Exactly.
That makes total sense. Okay, so we've talked about input, intake, output. Where does fluency fit into all of this? Because that's kind of the holy grail, right? That's what we're all aiming for, right?
It is, but Bonatti's view on fluency is actually quite different from the traditional definition.
Okay, so how does he define it?
Well, he basically argues that fluency isn't about this magical point where you have perfect grammar and a massive vocabulary. It's more about developing this robust mental language system
Interesting.
through, and this will probably sound familiar, consistent exposure to comprehensible input.
Right. So it all comes back to that input.
Exactly, and it's about being able to navigate the language more intuitively, even if you're not always using it perfectly.
So it's less about striving for this kind of idealized perfection and more about just feeling comfortable communicating your message, even if you make a few mistakes along the way.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like learning to ride a bike. You don't become a confident cyclist by just reading about bikes and studying the physics of balance, right?
Right.
You learn by doing, by falling,
Right.
by getting back up and kind of gradually developing that unconscious understanding of how to stay upright.
That's such a good analogy. So in the same way, we achieve fluency in a language not by overthinking every little detail, but by just immersing ourselves in it and letting our brains kind of do their thing.
Precisely.
Wow. This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
It's a big shift, for sure. And Bonatti actually goes as far as to say that while explicit grammar instruction can be helpful at times,
Right.
too much focus on it can actually be counterproductive.
Really?
Yeah, because it can kind of hinder the development of that intuitive sense of the language. It's like trying to ride that bike while consciously thinking about every single movement of your body. You're probably just going to fall over.
Right. It takes all the fun out of it, too.
Exactly.
Okay, so if I'm aiming for this more natural, intuitive kind of fluency, what are some practical things that I can do? What does Benatti recommend?
One of his biggest recommendations is this idea of seeking out immersive experiences.
So finding ways to just surround myself with the language, even if I'm not actively studying.
Exactly. Things like listening to music, watching films, even just changing the language settings on your phone or your computer, all of that can make a huge difference.
It's like creating this little language learning nest for yourself.
Exactly.
But what about active practice? What does Benatti say about that?
He's a big advocate for engaging in activities that actually require you to use the language for a real purpose, not just mindless repetition.
Okay, yeah, like what kind of things?
So, having conversations,
Right.
reading about topics that you actually find interesting, maybe even trying to write a blog post or something in your target language.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And this is where things get a little bit controversial because Bonatti's view is that, particularly in those early stages of learning, output shouldn't necessarily be about striving for perfect grammar.
Oh, really?
It should be more about just trying to communicate your message, even if it's a little bit messy.
Wait, so you're telling me that I shouldn't be worried about making mistakes when I speak?
Not at all. In fact, he actually encourages learners to kind of embrace those mistakes.
Okay.
because they're valuable learning opportunities.
Yeah, that's such a relief to hear because I feel like I've always been so terrified of making mistakes that it's kind of held me back.
Yeah, I think that's really common.
It's nice to know that it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, and Bonatti really emphasizes that those mistakes are an essential part of the journey. It's like, learning to walk. You don't expect a baby to just get up and start walking perfectly,
Yeah.
right? They're going to fall down, they're going to stumble, but each one of those little stumbles is actually helping them to refine their balance.
And eventually they get there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's the same with language learning. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a willingness to kind of embrace those ups and downs along the way.
Wow. This whole conversation has really shifted my perspective because I feel like I've always been so focused on trying to be perfect in my target language. And this is making me realize that it's more about just enjoying the process,
Yeah, exactly.
like letting go of that need for perfection and just focusing on the joy of communicating, even if it's not always perfect.
And the amazing thing is that Bonatti actually backs this up with a lot of research.
Really?
Yeah, he cites all these studies showing that learners who focus on understanding and engaging with the language, even if they make mistakes,
Okay.
they actually make faster progress than those who are constantly preoccupied with accuracy.
That is fascinating. It's giving me permission to just kind of let go a little bit.
Good. That's what we want. And that's really what Donati wants to do with this book, right? He wants to give language learners the knowledge and the understanding to kind of take control of their own learning journey.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different things: input, intake, output, fluency. But what about grammar specifically? Because I know we touched on it a little bit before, but if we're not supposed to be focusing so much on those traditional grammar drills, what are some alternative approaches that Bonatti suggests?
Well, thankfully, his book is full of them. He talks about a lot of different techniques.
Things like structured input activities, input flood, textual enhancement, and they're all designed to make that grammar acquisition more implicit and, dare I say, more enjoyable.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just about memorizing those rules anymore.
Right.
It's about finding ways to make that learning more engaging and more meaningful.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Can you break those down for us? Like, what do those actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so let's start with structured input activities.
Okay.
So these are basically exercises or tasks that are designed to help learners focus on specific grammatical structures.
Okay.
But, and this is key, they do it in a way that still prioritizes meaning.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just about explicitly teaching the grammar rule.
Right.
It's about kind of subtly guiding learners towards noticing those structures in context.
Oh, interesting. So, for example, instead of launching into a lecture on, say, the past tense,
Yeah.
a structured input activity might involve having students listen to a story and then answer questions about the story. And those questions would naturally require them to use the past tense.
Oh, that's cool.
So they're getting that practice without even realizing that they're practicing grammar.
Right. It's like sneaking in those vegetables.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, what about input flood? That sounds a little intense.
It does sound intense, doesn't it? But it's actually not as overwhelming as it sounds. It's basically just this idea of surrounding yourself with as many examples of a particular grammatical structure as possible.
Oh, right.
So, for example, let's say you're trying to master the past tense.
Yeah.
You might spend a week listening to podcasts about history,
Whoa.
watching documentaries, reading books set in the past.
Right.
And the idea is that you're just flooding your brain with all these examples of the past tense in context.
Interesting.
And over time, your brain starts to pick up on those patterns.
So it's kind of like training your ear in a way.
Exactly.
Like if you listen to a particular genre of music enough, you start to be able to identify those different instruments.
Exactly. And it becomes much more natural and much less about, memorizing a list of rules.
I love that. Okay, so we've got structured input activities, input flood. What was the other one?
Textual enhancement.
Right, textual enhancement. What is that?
So this one's kind of cool. It basically involves highlighting or manipulating the target grammatical structure within a written text
Okay.
to make it really stand out to the learners.
So like bolding it or underlining it or something?
Exactly. And there's actually research showing that this kind of subtle visual cue
Yeah.
can make a big difference
Interesting.
because it's drawing learners' attention to that structure
Yeah.
without explicitly having to explain it.
So it's like giving them a little nudge in the right direction.
Exactly.
This is fascinating. Okay, so these are just a few of the techniques that Bonatti talks about, right?
Yeah, he talks about a lot more. This
Yeah.
is just scratching the surface.
I bet. And this has been so eye-opening already. It really feels like we've kind of gone from feeling stuck in that language learning rut to having this whole new toolkit.
And, that's what we were hoping for.
Yeah,
We want you to walk away from this feeling inspired and empowered to keep going on your language learning journey.
absolutely. And it's not about being perfect. It's about enjoying the process,
Exactly.
making those mistakes, embracing the messiness of it all.
Absolutely. And remembering that input is key.
It all comes back to that input.
It does.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about input, intake, output, fluency, grammar, and even some alternative approaches to language teaching.
It's been a deep dive.
It really has. If you're interested in exploring these ideas further, and we highly recommend that you do, be sure to check out Alessandro Bonatti's book.
Yes, it's called Second Language Teacher Education, a cognitive and evidence-based perspective.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's well worth the read. And as you continue on your language learning journey, remember to be kind to yourself, embrace those mistakes, and never stop exploring the world through the power of language.
Hear, hear.